The wind had been picking up since late afternoon, scraping across the empty fields outside town with that hollow, needling moan that always came before winter really set in. By the time the sun went down behind the jagged tree line, the temperature had dropped hard enough that the breath coming out of my mouth looked like pale smoke. I remember thinking that it felt colder than any November night I could recall in years, colder in a way that didn't feel natural. Like the air was thinner, as if everything around me was being held in a clenched fist. I was driving back to my sister's place after visiting my mother at the nursing home in Port Orchard. It was close to 10 p.m. when I turned off the highway, following the winding two-lane road that cut through 10 miles of woods before reaching the string of houses along Miller's Creek. My sister, Amy, had asked me to stay with her and my nephew that weekend while her husband was out of town. She didn't like being alone in the house at night. I used to tease her for that when we were younger, but after that night, I never joked about anyone's fear of the dark again. The thing people don't tell you about rural roads at night is how quickly they can shift from peaceful to unnerving. 1 minute, it's just you and the hum of the engine, the soft tunnel of your headlights, and the trees gliding by like silent spectators. The next minute, it feels like the forest presses closer. The shadows get heavier. The road feels narrower. You notice things you're not supposed to notice, like shapes between the trees or that sense that something is keeping pace with your car. I tried shaking off the feeling as I drove deeper into the woods. I cranked up the heater, tapped the steering wheel, and kept telling myself that this was just me being tired. But around mile marker 6, the first strange thing happened. My radio cut out. Not faded, not static. It snapped off mid-sentence, the screen going black. At the same exact moment, the headlights flickered, just a quick, sharp blink, but enough to make my stomach lurch. I slowed down, not because the road demanded it, but because something in me whispered that I should. A second later, I saw movement on the shoulder. A man was standing there. I hit the brakes so hard the car fishtailed slightly. He was just inside the edge of my headlights, facing me, but angled like he'd just emerged from the trees. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, but it was his face, or what I could make out of it, that locked me in place. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, over my car, almost like he was watching something behind me on the road. I waited for him to react, wave, yell, step forward. Anything, but he didn't move. Didn't blink, didn't shift, just stared past me with this fixed, glassy intensity that set my teeth on edge. I cracked my window an inch. "Hey, you all right?" I shouted. No response. The cold air pouring in stung my eyes, sharper than it should have been. I rolled the window back up and reached for my phone, thinking about calling State Patrol. But just as I lifted it, the man turned, slowly, like he had to remember how joints worked, and disappeared into the trees without a sound. Not walked, slipped, as if the darkness swallowed him whole. I waited another full minute before easing the car forward. The rest of the drive, my eyes stayed glued to the tree line. I kept expecting something to dart out or reappear ahead of me, but the road remained empty. When I finally reached my sister's driveway, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't tell her what happened. Amy was already anxious about being alone. I didn't want to add fuel to her worries, especially since I was sure, almost sure, that what I'd seen was just someone with car trouble who maybe didn't want help. That made sense. That was normal. That was something I could work with. Except that wasn't the last time I saw him. Not even close. Amy's house was a 2-story colonial with pale siding, a sagging porch swing, and woods stretching behind it thick enough to swallow cell signal. She greeted me at the door, wrapped in a blanket, her short blonde hair sticking up in every direction from stress and too little sleep. "Finally," she said, pulling me inside. I was starting to freak myself out. "It's just a weekend," I said, nudging her shoulder. "You'll survive." She didn't laugh. "Where's Caleb?" I asked. "Upstairs. He said he heard something outside his window about an hour ago. I'm sure it was just the wind, but he's scared, so he's in bed with the lamp on." For a moment, something cold crawled down my spine. "What kind of something?" I asked. She shrugged. "Scratching or knocking. He couldn't explain it well." I forced a smile. Kids had wild imaginations. That part was easy to rationalize, but the timing, it sat wrong in my gut. I'll check the yard in the morning, I said. We stayed up another hour talking about Mom, about her job, about my nephew's school, everything ordinary and grounding. By midnight, we were both tired enough to crash. She went upstairs to her room, and I took the guest room at the end of the hall. It wasn't until I settled under the blankets that I realized something. The woods outside the window were completely silent. No wind, no branches shifting, no coyotes, nothing. When you grow up in the countryside, silence isn't comforting. Silence means something is wrong. I told myself it was just the weather. November cold could be brutal. Maybe the animals were hunkering down. But around 2 a.m., I woke up gasping. Not from a nightmare, not from a sound, from the feeling that something was watching me through the window. I didn't move at first. I just let my eyes adjust and scanned the darkness. The yard was dimly visible under the thin smear of moonlight. The trees behind the house loomed like black pillars. I saw nothing, but I felt it. The same weight I'd felt on the road, like a presence. Eventually, sleep tugged me back down, heavy and reluctant. Morning came gray and icy. I stepped outside to check the backyard while Amy made coffee. Frost covered the grass in uneven stripes. The woods looked like they'd grown denser overnight, roots pushing closer to the property. I walked toward the tree line, expecting maybe to find raccoon prints or deer tracks, something to explain the sounds Caleb heard. What I found instead made my skin crawl. Footprints. Bare footprints. They led from the woods to the patch of dirt directly under Caleb's window. And they weren't crisp like someone walking barefoot normally. They were smeared, dragging slightly, like whoever made them had swayed or limped. They looked recent, too. Recent enough that the frost hadn't fully settled in them. I stared at them, cold tightening around my throat. When I followed them back toward the trees, they faded and then disappeared altogether as soon as they reached the shadows. "Everything okay?" Amy called from the porch. I forced myself to turn around like nothing was wrong. Yeah, probably just someone cutting through the woods. But no one took barefoot strolls through those woods in 30-degree weather. That day passed in a sort of tense normalcy. I tried not to focus on what I'd seen. I stuck around the house, played board games with Caleb, helped Amy clean up the attic, made dinner. All perfectly ordinary. But the woods never left my peripherals. Every time I looked out a window, I found myself checking the dark between the trees, and each time I felt something looking back. By dusk, clouds had rolled in again, turning the sky into a heavy slate ceiling. The temperature crashed even lower. By the time we sat down to watch a movie, the wind had picked up into sharp, irregular gusts. Halfway through the film, the lights flickered. Amy tensed. "It's fine," I said. "Probably lines freezing." Then the house went completely dark. "Shit," I muttered, standing. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and headed toward the kitchen where the breaker box was. I'd made it halfway across the living room when I heard something upstairs. A sound I couldn't immediately place. A slow, deliberate thump. "Caleb?" Amy whispered. "He's in bed," I said softly. Another thump, this one heavier, directly above us. Amy reached for my arm. "Someone's in the house." "We don't know that," I said, but my voice trembled. The house was old, pipes shifted, wood contracted and cold. But this sound wasn't shifting pipes. It was footsteps. I motioned for Amy to stay behind me as we moved toward the stairs. Halfway up, the air temperature dropped fast enough that I could see my breath again. The steps stopped. We reached the top landing, and everything went still. The hallway stretched ahead of us, dimly lit by my phone. Caleb's door was cracked open. Amy hurried to peek in. He was asleep, curled under blankets. I turned to check the rest of the hall, and froze. There was a figure standing at the far end, tall, thin, motionless. For half a second, I thought it was a coat rack or a shadow, something my mind was twisting into something human-shaped. But then it shifted, barely, like it was leaning. I raised the light. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Empty, but the cold lingered, and the air smelled wrong, like wet earth, like soil. My heart hammered in my throat. We checked every room, closet, bathroom, attic door latch. Nothing looked disturbed. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. But the feeling didn't leave. If anything, it grew heavier. The lights eventually came back on, but neither Amy nor I could shake the sense that someone or something had been in the house. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape in the hallway again. So I sat downstairs with a mug of lukewarm tea, watching the windows. The woods outside were darker than ink. Around 3 a.m., something moved between the trees. At first, it looked like a trick of my tired eyes, a shifting shadow. Then it stepped out. The man. The man from the roadside. Except something was different about him. He wasn't leaning or shivering in the cold. He stood perfectly still, his posture wrong, too straight, too rigid. His arms hung at his sides like dead weight. Even from inside the house, across 50 feet of yard, I could see his face clearly. He wasn't looking at the window. He was looking above it, at the second-floor windows, at Caleb's window. A wave of dread rolled through me so strong it nearly buckled my knees. I reached for my phone to call the sheriff. But before I could dial, the man turned, slowly, and walked back into the woods. Not walked. Glided, like his feet weren't bending at the joints. I stayed awake until sunrise. When I checked the backyard again, the footprints were back. Fresh ones. Leading to Caleb's window again. Dragging, uneven, bare. I followed them into the woods as far as I dared, but like before, they vanished deep in the shadows. I didn't tell Amy. I didn't know how. By afternoon, a storm warning went out. Temperatures were expected to plunge into the teens. The wind sharpened, the sky turned a flat, steely gray that made the whole landscape feel oppressive. Around 6 p.m., the sheriff arrived. Amy hadn't called him. He'd come on his own. Said he was doing a welfare check because our neighbor, half a mile down the road, had reported seeing a figure wandering the woods the night before. A tall man, barefoot. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Rollins, asked if we'd seen anything strange. Amy looked at me. I lied through my teeth, told him no, everything was fine. Probably just someone passing through. We'd lock up tight tonight, nothing to worry about. He gave us a look that said he didn't believe a word of it. Before he left, he said something that made my blood run cold. We've had 3 calls this week about a man fitting that description, always around houses near the tree line, always at night, doesn't say a word, doesn't respond when spoken to. Whoever, whatever he is, keep your family inside. After he drove off, I made sure every window was locked, every curtain closed. I moved a heavy dresser in front of the back door. Amy didn't argue. Around 10 p.m., the storm hit full force. The house groaned under the wind. Snow started falling thick and fast. The world outside vanished into white. Inside, the temperature dropped again. The furnace kicked on, then off, then on, then off. By midnight, the power cut out again. This time, it didn't come back. Amy, frantic, lit candles while I gathered blankets. The house was freezing. I could feel the cold radiating from the windows like a living thing pressing its face against the glass. Then the scratching started. Soft, slow, methodical. From the back of the house, from the kitchen window. Amy grabbed my arm, nails digging into my sleeve. We moved together, barely breathing. The kitchen was pitch black, except for the faint orange glow of candles from the living room. The scratching grew louder as we approached. Something was dragging its fingers across the glass. I forced myself forward until I could see the window silhouette. My breath fogged in front of me. I lifted my phone, turned on the flashlight, and the beam hit the window. He was there, face pressed against the glass, mouth open too wide, eyes milky and unfocused, skin gray-blue from cold. His hands smeared slowly down the window pane, leaving streaks of frost and something darker. Amy screamed. I stumbled backwards, slamming into the counter. The figure didn't react to her scream, didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just stared, though not at us. Through us, past us. I grabbed Amy and pulled her out of the kitchen. Caleb was crying upstairs. The scratching turned into pounding. Slow at first, then violent, rattling the entire window frame. Glass groaned. I ran upstairs, grabbed Caleb, brought him into the hallway. Amy was behind us, crying, shaking. Then, silence. The pounding stopped. The house held its breath. And then the footsteps began. Around the side of the house, crunching through snow, heading toward the front porch, the door handle rattled, slowly at first, then harder, harder, like something desperately trying to remember how to use it. I shoved the hallway dresser down the stairs. Amy grabbed the phone. Still dead. No signal. No power. The storm roaring outside drowned out everything else. But then a new sound rose beneath the wind. Not scratching, not pounding. A voice coming from the front door. Hoarse, broken, too deep, too wrong. Let me in. Amy covered Caleb's ears, sobbing. I stood there frozen, heart slamming against my ribs. The voice came again. Let me in. I'm cold. The way he said cold, it stretched too long like he was chewing on the word. Then the doorknob stopped rattling. Silence again. A silence that somehow felt louder. Seconds dragged. Minutes. Then, from directly above us, footsteps. But the roof was 2 stories high. There was no porch roof, no branches hanging near the house, nothing for something to stand on. The footsteps moved toward the house's center. Snow sifted down past the windows, shaken loose from something heavy above us. Amy was trembling so bad I thought she might faint. Caleb clung to her neck. Then, a scraping sound at Caleb's bedroom window. Slow, long, drawn out. Something was on the roof, trying to get in again. We backed down the hall, closer together, listening as the thing crawled across the shingles with a shuddering, dragging movement. Snow pattered against the glass as whatever it was shifted its weight. Then it stopped, right outside my guest room window. The window creaked, not opening, bowing, pushing inward, like something was pressing its face against it. I gripped a lamp, ready to swing it at anything that came through. Amy held Caleb against her chest, whispering over and over, "Don't look, don't look." A long minute passed, then another, and then a sound I'll never forget, knocking, 3 gentle knocks on the window, like someone politely asking to come in. I couldn't breathe. Another knock. Then the voice, right outside the glass. "Let me in. I'm cold." Something moved behind the curtains, a shadow, a shape leaning close, too close. I raised the lamp higher. The shadow twitched, and then vanished. The pressure on the glass disappeared. The footsteps scraped across the roof again, moving away toward the far side of the house, until finally, nothing. We didn't sleep. We sat in the hallway, shaking, waiting for dawn. Every creak of the house made us flinch. Every gust of wind felt like it carried footsteps. When daylight finally bled into the sky, weak and watery, the storm had mostly passed. I forced myself outside. The cold hit me like a fist. Snow covered everything in deep mounds. The roof had long drag marks streaking across it, jagged trails like something heavy had been pulled across the shingles. At the base of the house, under the windows, footprints, bare, deep enough that the person, if it was a person, had to have been freezing. A trail of them led back toward the woods. I followed them until the tree line. There, just before the footprints disappeared into the dark of the forest, I found something half buried in snow. A scrap of cloth. Dark, frozen stiff. When I picked it up, the smell hit me. Soil. Rot, like something pulled from 6 feet under. I dropped it. I didn't go any farther. The sheriff came back around noon after the roads cleared some. He found the footprints, the drag marks, the scrap of cloth. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he told us this. 3 weeks earlier, a man from 2 towns over had gone missing. 42 years old. History of sleepwalking. Sometimes wandered into the woods behind his house. They found his body 6 days ago. Frozen. Partially buried. They assumed he died of exposure. He had no shoes when they found him. When they showed the family the clothing scrap, they confirmed it belonged to him. The sheriff's face went pale when he realized what that meant. Whatever had come to our house that night, it wasn't a living man. Not anymore. Amy moved out before winter ended. She sold the house to a developer who planned to tear it down. I never went back after that weekend. I still dream about that voice, that dragging gait, that scraping along the windows. Sometimes when November comes around, I swear I hear knocking on my apartment window. 3 slow taps. Polite. Patient. Let me in. I'm cold. I never open the curtains. I don't think I ever will. Story, the end. The wind howled outside the small cabin, rattling the windows as if testing their strength. Inside, the fireplace crackled, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Emma sat in the worn armchair, her knees pulled close to her chest, staring into the fire. November in Vermont had a way of making everything feel heavier, colder, lonelier. The snow had started falling in the late afternoon, a thick, wet sort that clung to branches and coated the roads, making the journey back from town treacherous. She'd barely made it in time, the car sliding once on the icy driveway before she finally wrestled it into the garage. Her husband, David, was out at the hardware store earlier, promising to be back before dark, but it was already well past 6. The cabin was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbors, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to lean in closer with every gust of wind. Emma tried to focus on the fire, the comforting warmth that pushed against the creeping chill, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't uncommon in these parts to feel a kind of quiet unease. There was an old, almost superstitious tension in the air every winter. But tonight felt different. A soft thump came from outside, and Emma froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She strained her ears against the roaring wind. A second thump, louder this time, reverberated against the side of the cabin. She swallowed hard, reminding herself that the sound could be anything: a branch, a loose shutter, a deer. Yet instinct whispered that it was none of those things. Slowly, she rose, crossing the cabin to the window that faced the driveway. Peering through the frost-lined glass, she could just make out the dim outline of the snow-covered path, the woods pressing in behind it. Nothing moved. "David?" she called softly, hoping it was just him pulling into the garage late. No answer. Her stomach twisted as she opened the door, stepping into the freezing wind, snow crunching under her boots. The driveway was empty. A low moan carried through the trees. She spun around, panic prickling at the edges of her mind. The sound was distant, yet unmistakably human. She wanted to tell herself it was the wind, some trick of the storm, but the tone, long drawn, desperate, sent her retreating back into the warmth of the cabin. By the time David returned, it was nearly 7. He was carrying a small bag of supplies, his coat dusted with snow, cheeks pink from the cold. "Sorry, the roads were awful," he said, shrugging off his jacket. He didn't notice the tension on her face, the way her fingers trembled as she set the fire poker back in its holder. "It's nothing," she said, forcing a smile. "I just heard something outside." David laughed softly, ruffling her hair. "You've been cooped up too long. It's just the storm." Emma wanted to believe him, but that night sleep came in fits. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind against the walls made her sit upright in bed, heart hammering. Around midnight, a sound like dragging echoed outside, slow and deliberate. Emma didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. It stopped after a few minutes, leaving only the storm and the unsettling silence of the woods. The next morning, snow covered everything, deep and pristine. David joked about shoveling the driveway, but Emma couldn't shake the memory of last night. Something had been out there. Something that didn't belong. Days passed and the feeling never left. Objects in the cabin seemed subtly displaced. A chair slightly closer to the fireplace than she remembered, a door left ajar that she was certain she had shut. Emma chalked it up to stress, to the long stretch of isolation, but David's impatience grew. "You're imagining things," he'd say, and his tone was firm, almost harsh. "We're alone here. Nothing's out there." One evening, Emma was chopping wood in the backyard when she heard laughter, soft, almost musical, floating from the edge of the trees. She froze, her axe in mid-swing. David had gone into town for supplies hours ago, leaving her alone. She called out, but the laughter stopped, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against her eardrums. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Something was moving in the woods, just beyond the clearing, watching. By the end of the week, Emma was convinced of it. Shadows moved differently than they should have. There were glimpses of figures in the trees, never clear, never fully formed, always just beyond the corner of her eye. David's dismissals grew routine, but he could see it too, finally, in the way she jumped at every sound, the pallor of her skin, the tightness in her voice. Then the whispers started. At first she thought she imagined them, little murmurs at the edge of hearing when she was alone in the kitchen or bathroom. Soon they became clearer, distinct voices calling her name, sometimes urgent, sometimes pleading. "Emma! Emma!" One night, as the wind tore across the roof, the whispers coalesced into something almost intelligible. "Help us." Emma bolted upright in bed. David was snoring beside her, oblivious. Her mind raced. The voices came from the woods. She was certain. Something or someone was out there, trapped or waiting. She didn't know which terrified her more. By the following weekend, the storm had worsened. Roads were impassable, isolation complete. David went out one morning to check the generator, promising to be back quickly. He didn't return. Hours passed and panic replaced fear. Emma searched the snow-covered yard, calling his name, but the wind swallowed it. Tracks led away from the cabin in jagged, uneven paths, ending abruptly at the tree line. She followed them for a short distance, but had to turn back. The snowstorm was relentless. That night, the cabin seemed alive. Footsteps echoed on the stairs, soft thumps against walls, whispers behind doors. Emma barricaded herself in the bedroom, clutching the fireplace poker. Around midnight, the bedroom door rattled violently. Something or things were trying to get in. She screamed, pounding on the door, but no answer came. The whispers turned into frantic, pleading cries. Morning came, gray and heavy, the storm subsiding slightly. David was gone, and the cabin bore subtle signs of intrusion. The pantry door left open, a chair overturned, a strange symbol scratched into the wooden floorboards. Emma knew she couldn't stay, couldn't wait for help. She bundled herself into layers and ventured into the woods, following vague paths she hoped might lead to a road or neighbor. The forest was silent except for the crunch of snow beneath her boots. Hours passed. Shadows shifted unnaturally, branches seemed to reach for her. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. She stumbled upon a clearing where the snow was disturbed in a grotesque pattern, footprints too large, too irregular, leading into a dense thicket. Emma's stomach turned, and she turned back, desperate to return to the cabin, to the relative safety of walls she now knew offered little protection. That night she heard the whispers again, closer this time, almost within the room with her. She dared to glance out the window. Shapes moved in the snow, not quite human, not quite animal, their forms blurred as if smeared by the storm. One stepped closer to the cabin, halting just at the tree line, and stared. Emma couldn't see eyes, couldn't see a face, but she knew it was watching her, calculating. Days bled into nights in a haze of fear. Emma rationed food, water, firewood, but sleep became impossible. Every sound, every shadow triggered panic. She started talking to herself to maintain sanity, whispering reminders that she was alone, that she had to survive. But the whispers never stopped. They grew bolder, echoing through the cabin, answering her questions, mocking her, calling her to the woods. One evening, as twilight bled across the snow, Emma finally saw them clearly. 3 figures emerging from the tree line, tall, thin, their limbs disproportionate, faces featureless except for dark, gaping voids where eyes should be. They moved deliberately, silently, stopping just beyond the cabin door. Emma froze, unable to scream, unable to move. They tilted their heads almost in curiosity as if studying her before retreating into the trees without a sound. The next morning, Emma packed what she could carry and left the cabin, abandoning everything. She hiked for hours through the snow until she found the road, flagged down a passing truck, and was taken to the nearest town. Trembling, she tried to explain, but the locals shook their heads. The cabin had a reputation, they said, old stories of disappearances, strange figures in the woods, but no one took it seriously. The authorities checked. David was never found. The cabin showed no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Emma moved away, tried to forget, but she could never escape the whispers. Sometimes at night, she hears them again, soft and persistent, calling her name, urging her back to the snow-covered woods of Vermont, back to the cabin that still waits, patient and hungry. She never speaks of what she saw, because she fears that speaking it aloud will call them closer, that admitting the truth might invite them into the world she has left behind. Even now, in a warm apartment far from the forest, she sometimes wakes to the sound of footsteps on stairs, the faint scraping of claws across walls, and the voices, always the voices just beyond hearing, calling her name. Story the end. The wind had a way of finding every gap in the old farmhouse, every seam in the walls, every loose floorboard, every crack in the window frames, until it felt like the night itself was trying to get in. That November had come in colder than anyone in Knox County expected, the kind of cold that gnawed at bone and settled in the marrow. By dusk, the fields around the property were already coated in frost, pale and glittering under a bruised, cloud-smothered sky. I'd moved into the farmhouse 2 weeks earlier, 36 years old, recently separated, and desperate, not for a fresh start exactly, but for somewhere quiet enough to sort my thoughts out. A friend of a friend owned the place and rented it cheap on account of its age and distance from town. It stood alone at the end of a long dirt drive, surrounded by leafless trees and fields that hadn't been planted in years. The quiet was fine at first. Therapeutic, even. But by the second week, the silence felt different. Heavy. Like something else was sharing it with me. That night, the night everything split open, started with the wind. It howled around the corners of the house, tugged at the shutters, and rattled the old tin roof like someone pacing above me. I told myself it was just the storm rolling in early, But storms don't drag their knuckles. They don't linger at the edges of your hearing, waiting. By 8 o'clock, the house felt colder inside than it had any right to be. I checked the thermostat twice. The furnace was running. The vents blew warm enough. But the air kept thinning, losing its warmth as if something were swallowing it. I layered up, sweatshirt, socks, flannel pants, and settled into the living room with a mug of coffee. I tried reading, but my eyes kept drifting toward the windows. The glass was dark, reflective, but every so often I thought I saw movement just beyond it. Not shapes exactly, more like the impression of something passing by. At 9:30, I heard the first knock. It wasn't on the front door. It came from inside the house, a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap from the wall behind me. Old houses make noises. They contract in the cold, they settle, but walls don't knock in patterns. I froze. The knocking stopped. When it didn't come again, I forced myself to breathe and went back to pretending to read. But then, 10 minutes later, tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks. Slow. Higher up the wall this time. I set the book down and stood. The sound had come from the wall that bordered the narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms. That hallway was always darker than the rest of the house, even when the lights were on, like the shadows stuck to the walls a little too stubbornly. Old house, I muttered to myself. Just the damn house settling. But I didn't believe it. I turned on the hall light anyway. The bulb flickered once, then steadied. The air in the hall was noticeably colder, so cold my breath fogged. That shouldn't have been possible this close to the living room vent. I walked the length of the hall, pressing my palm against the wall where the knocking had come from. It felt like touching stone. Not drywall. Stone. Freezing cold. I held my hand there, leaning in slightly. That's when I felt it. A knock. A clear, undeniable knock from the other side of the wall, right beneath my hand. I yanked my hand back and stumbled. For a moment, every instinct screamed at me to get out of the house, to leave everything and run into the cold night, storm or no storm. But logic fought its way in. There was no other side of that wall. The house didn't have a basement, no crawl space, just the solid, dated structure on a concrete foundation. Nobody could be in the wall. I checked my phone. No service, which wasn't unusual out there, but the knocking didn't return for the rest of the hour, and eventually I convinced myself it was a pipe, or the wind pushing through somewhere, or hell, even my imagination. By a little after 11, exhaustion won. I turned off the lights, left the hallway alone, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. The bedroom I used was the only one up there. The rest of the second floor was unfinished storage space that smelled of old wood and dust. I closed the bedroom door behind me, changed into heavier socks, and crawled into bed. Outside, the wind screeched like something was circling the house. The rafters groaned. The walls clicked and popped with temperature shifts. But eventually I fell asleep. It couldn't have been long before I woke again. Maybe an hour, maybe less, the sound that pulled me out of sleep. A sound I recognized immediately because I'd heard it all evening. Knocking. Not on the wall this time. On the bedroom door. 3 knocks. Soft, as if someone didn't want to wake me but needed to. I sat up, every hair on my body rising. The room was so cold I could see my breath again, this time in steady, trembling clouds. I listened. Nothing. Then tap, tap, tap. Hello? The word left my mouth before I could stop it, stupid and fragile in the dark. No reply. The house went dead quiet, as though it were listening. I reached for the lamp, but the moment my fingers brushed the switch, the knocking came again. Closer. Faster. More urgent. Tap, 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 tap. I turned on the lamp. The light flickered, dimmed, came back. Something was wrong with the air. It felt thick, like trying to breathe through cold syrup. My chest tightened, my ears popped, then the doorknob moved, just slightly, enough to click. I pulled the blankets around me like a shield, even though I knew how ridiculous that was. My legs wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. The knob twisted again. Slowly. Deliberately. I didn't know whether to scream or stay silent. My throat locked up anyway. The knob stopped turning, pausing at the halfway point, then snapped back as if something on the other side had let go. Silence. Absolute. Paralyzing. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time felt stretched in that freezing room. Eventually, I swung my legs out of bed. My feet hit the floor, and the wood felt wet. I pulled my foot back and looked. Nothing there. Bone dry. I grabbed the heaviest object I had, an old metal flashlight, and crept toward the door. When I touched the knob, it was warm. Too warm. Human warm. I pulled my hand away fast and wiped it on my shirt, heart racing harder. I forced myself to grip it again and turn it. The door opened into the hallway. Empty. But the air out there was even colder than the bedroom. I stepped forward cautiously, shining the flashlight around. The beam jittered because my hand wouldn't stop shaking. No footprints. No sign of anyone. Just the long, narrow hall disappearing into shadow. The living room light downstairs was on. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I knew I had turned off every damn light in that house before going to bed. I descended the stairs slowly, stepping on the boards I knew were least likely to creak. The temperature dropped more as I went, as if the cold were sinking down the steps with me. Halfway down, the flashlight sputtered, then died. Pitch black. I slapped it against my palm, but nothing, not even a dim glow. The wind outside suddenly stopped, cut off, not faded, stopped, like something had pressed pause on the night. The silence that followed wasn't natural. It felt like the air was listening again, waiting. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the living room light flickered violently, then steadied. I stepped forward, straight into the smell. Rot, wet earth, and something else underneath, metallic and sharp, like rusted iron. I froze. The smell wasn't coming from the kitchen or the windows or the vents. It was coming from the center of the living room. The light flickered again, and then I saw it. A shape, standing in the corner near the hallway entrance. It wasn't a full figure, not at first. More like a darker patch of darkness, a distortion in the air, as if the shadows were folding inward to form it. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. When I opened them again, the shape was clearer, taller, broader. I stepped back instinctively. A floorboard groaned beneath me. The shape twitched. Its head, or what I assumed was its head, shifted toward me. Though the room was lit, the thing stayed impossibly dark, like light bent around it. Then it moved. Not toward me, along the wall, gliding, as though its feet didn't touch the floor. I stumbled backward, breath catching in my throat. My heel hit the rug, and I tripped, falling hard onto my elbows. A bright pain shot up my arms. The shape stuttered, flickered, and vanished. I scrambled to my feet, eyes wild, scanning every corner. Nothing. The room looked normal again, too normal. The smell was gone. The air felt lighter. The temperature rose slightly. For a brief, stupid moment, I convinced myself I'd hallucinated it. The stress, the cold, the loneliness, it had twisted everything. But then I heard something from behind me, from upstairs. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I darted toward the front door. My hands were so cold I fumbled with the lock twice before getting it open. The outside air hit me, freezing but clean. I bolted onto the porch and heard footsteps behind me. Fast. Running. Coming down the stairs. I leaped off the porch and sprinted toward my truck. My breath tore out of my lungs in white bursts. Frost crunched beneath my shoes. Halfway across the yard, the porch light behind me flickered on. Then off. Then on again. I didn't look back, not until I reached the truck and yanked the door open. When I finally did turn, something was standing at the edge of the porch. This time there was no distortion, no half-formed shadow. It was fully there. Tall, gaunt, with limbs too long for its body. Skin stretched thin and pale, like wax. A face with no mouth, no nose, just deep, sunken eyes that reflected the porch light like animal eyes at night. It leaned forward slightly, as though listening, or smelling me. My keys shook in my hands so violently I dropped them. They disappeared into the frosted grass. I dropped to my knees, sweeping my hands over the frozen ground, searching blindly. Behind me, something stepped off the porch, onto the yard, onto the grass. One slow step at a time. The air thickened again. The cold deepened. My fingers brushed metal. I snatched the keys and scrambled into the truck, slamming the door and locking it. The thing stood 10 feet away now, close enough for me to see frost forming along its arms. I jammed the key into the ignition, turned it. The engine coughed, failed, coughed again. The thing tilted its head, like it was curious. The engine roared to life. I stomped on the gas and tore down the driveway so fast the truck fishtailed on the frozen dirt. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the sky lightened with approaching dawn and my hands stopped shaking long enough for me to dial 911. Deputies checked the house later that morning, told me it was empty, no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the yard besides mine. They chalked it up to stress, exhaustion, and the isolation of the countryside. I didn't go back for my things. Couldn't. I left everything behind. The clothes, the furniture, the half-read book, the coffee mug still sitting on the table. But sometimes, especially in November, when the nights turn sharp and the wind scours the fields, I dream of the knocking. 3 soft taps, just outside my bedroom door. And sometimes I wake because I swear I hear footsteps in the hall. Slow, dragging, searching. I haven't been back to that part of Knox County since. But last week I saw a listing online. Farmhouse for rent. Cheap. Recently vacated. Owner looking for a long-term tenant. The photos showed the living room, the old rug, the narrow hallway, and in one picture, just one, there was a tall, dark shape in the corner. Blurry, almost invisible, but there. Waiting. Story the end. A cold November night settles in faster than it should. I didn't used to believe that a night could feel wrong like it carried its own intention until the year everything fell apart. People like to say the mind plays tricks on you when you're tired, when you're depressed, when you've gone through something traumatic. But what I saw, what I heard, and what I lived through that November wasn't exhaustion or grief, and it wasn't imagination. I wish it had been. It started the week after daylight saving time ended, when the nights felt unnaturally long and the air seemed to freeze before it touched your skin. The weird part is that everything felt perfectly normal right up until the day it didn't. I had just turned 30. I was living alone for the first time since college. My long-term relationship had ended a few months earlier, and I'd moved into a small rental house in a quiet town outside of Bangor, Maine. I'd taken the place because it was cheap, furnished, and close enough to work that even winter storms wouldn't trap me. I wasn't in love with the idea of living alone, especially not in a creaky old structure from the 1940s, but I told myself it would be temporary. The house sat at the end of a narrow, unlit road. There were a few other homes down the stretch, but the trees and the uneven terrain meant I couldn't see any neighbors unless I really tried. Behind the house was nothing but woods, dense, dark pine forest that went on for miles. During the day, it was peaceful. At night, it was a completely different world. The first strange thing happened on November 7th. I was driving home from work, and as I turned onto my road, I noticed movement in my headlights. Something crossing the road just at the edge of the beam. Not a deer. Not a fox. Something low to the ground, fast and pale. I only saw it for a second, but the way it moved, it almost slid instead of ran. When I reached the spot where it had passed, nothing was there. No tracks. No disturbed leaves. I told myself it was probably an albino raccoon or something. Maine has weird wildlife sometimes, but the feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. That night, I heard scratching against the back of the house. Light, deliberate scratching. At first, I assumed it was branches brushing the siding. The wind was fierce, rattling the windows and howling through the trees. But when I turned off the TV, the scratching didn't match the rhythm of the wind at all. 3 slow scratches. A pause. 3 more. It came from low on the wall, near the back door. Every hair on my arm stood up. I approached the door slowly, half expecting an animal to suddenly claw or throw itself at it, but the moment I reached the handle, the scratching stopped. Just stopped. I waited a minute. 2. Then I opened the door. Nothing was there. The cold air punched me in the face, and the backyard lay silent beneath the moonlight. No wind, no movement, just cold, still darkness. It felt like I had interrupted something. I shrugged it off because that's what people do. They rationalize things that don't make sense. I locked the door, turned the porch light on, even though the bulb was so weak it barely illuminated anything, and forced myself to go to bed. But that night, I dreamed of the scratching. I dreamed of something moving behind the house, something too thin, too pale, something with fingers. I woke up around 3 a.m. with my heart hammering and the sense that something had brushed the outside of my bedroom window. The next day at work, I tried to laugh about it with a coworker, but even as I described it, something in my voice sounded off. She told me I was probably adjusting to living alone and that old houses love to make creepy sounds. Maybe they do. But the house wasn't the one making the sounds. The second incident happened 3 days later. I came home to find footprints in the backyard. Not animal footprints. Bare footprints. Human. They trailed from the tree line straight toward the back door, then stopped only a foot away from it, as if someone had stood there for a while. The prints were small, maybe size 6 or 7. Too small for most men, too wide for a child. They were bare on a night that had dropped below freezing. I checked the lock twice before going inside. Nothing looked disturbed. But the feeling in my gut was unmistakable now. Someone had been standing at my back door, watching the house, watching me. I called the police, but they didn't have much to offer. The officer who came out looked around with his flashlight, took a few photos, and told me it was probably a teenager messing around. I didn't believe that for a second. Teenagers don't walk barefoot across frost-covered ground into the woods in November. Teenagers don't scratch at your house. That night I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight I heard something outside again, this time not scratching, something heavier. Slow, dragging steps on the porch. I held my breath and listened. Step, pause, step, pause. Then something touched the doorknob. It turned. Gently. Testing it. I covered my mouth with my hands to keep from making a sound. I slept with my bedroom door closed, but in that moment it didn't feel like enough. The doorknob clicked again and again, as if whatever was out there couldn't understand why it wouldn't open. After a few minutes that felt like hours, the steps moved away. I heard them descend the porch stairs, one slow step at a time, but they didn't walk into the woods. They moved along the side of the house, then beneath my bedroom window. For a long time I heard nothing. Then a whisper. So soft I thought it might be the wind at first. I heard my name. I didn't get a single second of sleep after that. The next morning I called my landlord. He brushed everything off and said no one else had ever complained about the house. He sounded annoyed more than anything, telling me that rural areas come with rural issues. Rural issues don't whisper your name in the middle of the night. By November 15th, I was exhausted. I started leaving the TV on all night because silence made everything worse. When the house was quiet, I'd hear things I didn't want to hear. Things I could no longer convince myself were animals or branches or the wind. One evening, as I was bringing groceries inside, I heard something snap in the woods. A branch. A heavy one. Something was out there. I scanned the tree line but didn't see anything. I hurried inside, locked the door, and pulled the curtains so fast I ripped one off the rod. I felt watched, constantly. Every night the scratching returned, some nights near the back door, some near the bedroom window, some near the kitchen. I took pictures of the footprints. I even considered setting up cameras. But every time I thought about putting one outside, something inside me recoiled. This irrational fear that if I recorded whatever was out there, I'd regret it. Then things escalated. One night around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud thud outside the house, followed by another and another. Like someone or something was throwing rocks at the walls. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the living room. Another rock hit the siding, hard enough to shake the window. I ducked behind the couch and peered out. The porch light, dim as it was, flicked twice, then went out completely. I could see only darkness, but I could feel something waiting there. Then came the sound I'll never forget, a low, rasping exhale. Not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. It lasted too long to be human. Then something scraped across the glass of the front window. Slowly, like a hand dragging across it. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't think. After several seconds of unbearable silence, a shape shifted just beyond the reach of the dying porch light. Too tall to be normal, too hunched to be natural. Something pale flashed between the dead bulbs and the dark woods. I dropped my phone, the screen lit up, and whatever was outside turned toward the glow. The window didn't break, but it bowed. The entire pane flexed inward, as if something pushed, not smashed against it. I ran into the bedroom, locked the door, and called 911. The dispatcher kept asking if someone was trying to break in. I didn't know how to answer that. Something, I whispered, and she paused, clearly unsure what to make of it. Halfway through the call, the noise stopped. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line until police arrived, but before they did, I heard footsteps again. Not outside, in the hallway, inside the house. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp, and pressed myself against the wall. The footsteps were slow, dragging, almost as if the thing was learning how to use legs. They stopped just outside my bedroom. I held my breath. Then the doorknob shook. Not wildly, Not forcefully, just testing. Just like before, I didn't scream. I couldn't. The footsteps moved away moments before the police knocked on the front door. When the officers searched the house, they found no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the hall, nothing disturbed. But outside, the backyard was a mess of tracks, dozens of footprints circling the house. Some were the same small, bare ones I'd seen before. Others were larger, much larger. And none of them walked back into the woods. They simply stopped, as if whoever made them had vanished. The officers asked if I wanted to stay somewhere else. I packed a bag in under a minute. I stayed in a motel for several nights and only returned in daylight with my landlord to gather the rest of my things. I moved out before the end of the month, lost my deposit, and didn't care. But even now, years later, I still think about that November night, about the footprints, about the scratching, about the whisper beneath my window, about the slow steps in the hallway, steps no one could explain. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I swear I still hear something scratching from outside. Not at the apartment I live in now. Not at the windows. Not at the door. Just somewhere outside. Somewhere close. As if whatever had come to that old rental house in Maine hadn't been tied to the house at all. As if it had been tied to me. As if it had followed. Story the end. A cold November night in northern Pennsylvania doesn't feel like a season. It feels like an intrusion. The kind that seeps through walls and settles in your bones, even if the thermostat claims you're warm. That was the kind of night it was when I learned what fear really meant. When a story I'd always dismissed as a local tall tale introduced itself as something much worse. I had driven up from Harrisburg after work, heading toward my uncle's cabin near the Allegheny National Forest. He'd passed away that summer, and I promised my mother I'd check on the place before winter storms began. It wasn't meant to be an emotional trip, just a quick overnight stay, a bit of cleaning, and back home by the next afternoon. The cabin sat on a lonely stretch of old logging road, 5 miles past the township line and bordered on all sides by forest. As a kid, I'd loved it. Bonfires, fishing, the sound of nothing but trees and birds. But that was before I grew older and understood that isolation didn't just mean peace, it also meant vulnerability. I arrived just before dusk. The sky had settled into that dull November gray, low and heavy like a warning. It wasn't snowing yet, but the wind carried flakes as if winter were tapping on the window, too impatient to wait. Inside, the cabin was colder than outside, the kind of cold that came from long neglect. My breath fogged as I dropped my bag near the old stone fireplace. Everything was dust-coated and stale, exactly as it had been left. A blanket still hung on the arm of the couch, and a mug sat on the table where my uncle had last placed it. A ghost of a life paused mid-motion. I started a fire first. Once the logs crackled and heat crawled into the room, the place felt a little less dead. I made myself a cup of instant coffee, sat on the couch, and listened to the wind howl across the chimney. It was a lonely sound, long and low, almost human. I told myself it was just the wind moving strangely through the trees, but something was off about it. Not wrong, just off. Around 8, I went outside to bring in more firewood. The air was sharply cold, the kind that numbs your fingers within seconds. I grabbed what I could and turned to head back inside. But as I did, I heard it again, the long, low moan coming from the woods. This time it wasn't the wind. It was too steady, too deliberate. It sounded like someone calling for help. I froze at the woodpile, my breath hanging in front of me. The moaning came again, carried faintly between the trees. "Hello?" I called out before I could stop myself. "Is someone out there?" The woods went silent. Only the ticking sound of cold branches shifting in the air answered back. I hurried inside, locked the door, and told myself I'd imagined it. Out in the wilderness, it wasn't unusual for sounds to carry strangely. Animals cried out, trees cracked, wind twisted through hollows in ways that made it sound like voices. Still, I kept the fire burning bright and stayed near it, as if the flames offered protection. By 10, the wind had risen into a full wail, rattling the cabin's windows. The fire popped loudly, throwing sparks upward. I rubbed my hands together, but despite the heat, my skin felt chilled, uneasy. I decided to call my mom before bed, just to check in. The call barely connected. Service was terrible out there. She asked how things were, and I lied, saying everything looked fine. "You sound tired," she said. "Long day. I'll go to sleep soon." Don't forget the basement, she added. Your uncle always said the pipes down there needed checking before winter. I promised I'd look, even though I hated the basement as a kid. It was a dirt-floored afterthought, just a foundation space with a furnace, old tools, and walls that sweated moisture. After the call dropped, I sat silently for a minute, staring at the basement door across the room. It was cracked open, just an inch or so, though I didn't remember leaving it that way. It was probably always like that, I told myself. But I got up, walked over, and shut it fully, making sure the latch clicked. I brushed my teeth using a bottled water since the tap smelled metallic and wrong, then settled into the small bunk bed in the corner of the main room. The fire still burned, but I let it fade. There was enough heat to last the night. I must have dozed off. I don't know how long I slept before the knocking started. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a dull, rhythmic thumping. But as I blinked awake, the cold air hit me, and I realized the sound was real. My heart hammered as I sat up, listening. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't at the door. It was coming from beneath me, from the basement. I sat there motionless, the blanket clutched tight. The knocks were slow, spaced apart unnaturally, like someone wanted to be sure I heard each one. I turned my head toward the basement door. It was open again, wide open this time, a dark rectangle in the dim room. No, I whispered without meaning to. No, no. I grabbed my phone from the bedside table. No service. Not even a single bar. The knocking stopped. I waited, stiff and silent. The wind howled outside, rattling branches against the siding. The fire flickered, dimming to embers. I told myself I was being ridiculous. That sounds echo in old houses, that the latch must not have caught when I closed the basement door earlier. But even as I rationalized, I couldn't bring myself to get up and close it again. Not yet. I must have sat awake for an hour, listening, waiting, until exhaustion pulled me back under. The second time I woke, it was to the distinct sound of footsteps on the wooden floor above me. Except I was on the main floor. The footsteps were overhead. Someone was in the cabin. I sat upright again, adrenaline lighting through my veins. I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving across the loft that overlooked the main room. My uncle had used the loft for storage. No one had any reason to be up there. No one should have been able to get inside at all. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. The windows were latched. I had checked everything. The footsteps creaked along the edge of the loft, directly above where I slept. I didn't breathe. The steps stopped. For a full minute, there was absolute silence. Then something scraped across the floor. Long, dragging, heavy. My skin prickled. I slowly slid out of bed, keeping my eyes on the loft railing overhead. The firelight was too faint to see much, but the shadows moved strangely, like someone was shifting just out of sight. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my only weapon, and inched backward toward the front door. My hand trembled as I reached for the lock. The footsteps started again, but this time they ran, fast, across the loft, straight toward the stairs. I yanked the door open and bolted into the freezing night, not even grabbing my coat. The cold wind slapped me hard, stealing my breath, but I didn't stop. I sprinted toward my car, slipping on frost-slick ground. Behind me, the cabin door creaked, then slammed shut. I reached the car, ripped the door open, and threw myself inside. The key shook between my fingers as I stabbed it into the ignition. The engine groaned, slow from the cold. Come on, come on. It started. I locked the doors immediately, heart thundering, and threw the car into reverse. Headlights illuminated the cabin, standing silent among the trees. No movement. No figure. Nothing. I should have driven away. I wanted to. But my phone sat inside the cabin on the table. I didn't dare go back for it. I drove to the end of the old road, managing to get a single bar of service. I called 911. When I explained that someone was inside the cabin, the operator asked if I could see them. No, I said. They were upstairs. I heard them running. The door slammed after I ran outside. 2 state troopers met me at the junction and followed me back. My nerves didn't settle even with their presence. The wind was bitter, tugging at branches that scratched the roof of my car. The troopers forced the cabin door open. Inside, everything was still. No footprints, no signs of a break-in, no disturbed dust on the loft floor, no shifted furniture, no opened window, nothing to show that anyone had been there at all. One trooper frowned at me. You said the basement door was open? He asked. Yeah, it kept opening on its own. He headed over and shined his flashlight down the stairs. The basement was empty, quiet, undisturbed, but he paused. "Smell that?" he murmured to his partner. A faint odor rose up the stairwell, metallic, damp, like old blood mixed with earth. His partner shook his head. "Animals get under these places sometimes. Something probably died under the foundation." But the trooper didn't look convinced. Still, with nothing else to go on and no signs of forced entry, they suggested it might have been an animal making noise or the cabin settling in the cold. They waited while I grabbed my phone and a few belongings. Then they followed me back to the main road. They asked if I wanted to stay at a motel in the next town, but I told them I'd drive home that night. I didn't want to be anywhere near those woods. I didn't sleep at all when I got home. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the footsteps again. The dragging, the knocking. The next morning, I called my mother and told her what happened. She was quiet a long time before she spoke. "You know," she said slowly, "your uncle used to say things about that place." I nearly dropped the phone. "What things?" She sighed, voice trembling faintly. "When he was a teenager, people went missing in those woods. 2 hunters, a girl from the next county, a highway worker. They never found them. Some locals said something lived out there, something that mimicked voices, sometimes even steps. They all thought it was just stories, but your uncle, he swore he heard things when he was alone in the cabin. Knocking. Footsteps above him even when no one was there." I felt sick. "He didn't like to talk about it," she went on. "Said whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen, but it liked to let him know when it was there." I sat there gripping the phone so tightly my hand went numb. She whispered, "He always said it was worse in November." For days afterward, I avoided thinking about it. I tried to rationalize, tried to bury it, but the memories refused to fade. The sounds, the cold air drifting from the basement, the door opening on its own, and the footsteps. Especially the footsteps. Every night, I'd lie awake in bed listening, waiting for the slightest creak above me, knowing that fear had settled into my bones. 2 weeks later, I got a call from one of the state troopers who'd checked the cabin that night. His tone was tense. "Sir, we just wanted to follow up. Were you aware of any old wells or root cellars on the property?" "No," I said. "Why?" He exhaled sharply. "We found an old collapsed tunnel under part of the cabin foundation. Looks like it used to connect to an abandoned mine shaft. The opening was hidden under the basement's dirt floor." My stomach dropped. "How old?" I managed. "Hard to say. Could be 100 years. But here's the thing. Something's been digging around it." "Digging?" I repeated. "Fresh movement. Soil disturbed. Like someone or something had crawled through recently." My mouth went dry. "We're sending out a geological team to check for sinkholes," he said, voice firm but uneasy. "But between you and me, stay away from that cabin, at least until we figure out what's down there." The call ended, but I kept staring at my phone long after. That night, as the wind scraped against my windows, I woke to a sound I'd prayed I'd never hear again. Knock, knock, knock. Not from the front door, not from outside, from under my bedroom floor. The cold November night pressed against the walls of my home, and I understood then, in the deepest, most terrifying way possible, whatever was beneath my uncle's cabin had not stayed behind. It had followed me. Story the end. The November wind cut through the trees outside the small town of Millersville like shards of glass, rattling windows and whispering through the skeletal branches. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional stray dog that padded along the cracked sidewalks, leaving faint prints in the thin dusting of early frost. It was the kind of night where even the faintest creak or groan of a house sounded sinister, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Lena Matthews had moved to Millersville only a few months earlier, taking a job as a night shift nurse at the county hospital. She had chosen the small town deliberately, seeking solitude after a messy divorce and the slow dissolution of her social life in the city. Her new apartment, a second-floor unit in a building dating back to the 1930s, had its charm. Old hardwood floors, tall windows, and a cast-iron radiator that hissed occasionally. But it also had an unnerving history. The landlord, an aging man named Mr. Whitaker, had mentioned casually, almost dismissively, that the building had been the site of some tragic events over the decades. Lena hadn't asked for details. She didn't want them. That night, Lena returned home after a 12-hour shift. She locked the door behind her, dropped her coat onto the back of a chair, and started the ritual of unwinding. Warm shower, cup of chamomile tea, and a brief scroll through her phone. The storm outside was picking up, gusts rattling the window panes, wind whistling down the narrow alley behind the building. Lena pulled her cardigan tighter around her and sank into the couch. It started around 11 o'clock. At first, it was just a faint tapping, like fingernails drumming lightly on the window. She dismissed it as branches hitting the glass in the wind. But then she heard a creaking from the hallway. Her apartment was small, but it had a long, narrow hallway connecting the living area to her bedroom and bathroom. Lena froze, straining her ears. The creaking wasn't random. It was deliberate, slow, almost measured, like someone walking carefully, deliberately. "Hello?" she called, her voice sounding shrill in the empty apartment. No answer. She grabbed the small flashlight she kept in the kitchen drawer, mostly for power outages, and crept down the hallway. The creaking stopped the moment she reached the end. Her bedroom door was closed, as always, and nothing seemed out of place. Heart racing, she checked the locks on the windows and doors. Everything was secure. By midnight, Lena was certain she was imagining things. Exhausted from her shift, she climbed into bed, pulled the covers tight, and tried to fall asleep. But just as her eyes started to close, she felt it. A presence in the room. Not something physical, but something heavy, like a weight pressing against her chest. The air grew cold, icy even, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, like a breath right beside her ear. She bolted upright in bed. "Who's there?" she shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the wind outside. The whisper came again, clearer this time, a single word drawn out and trembling. "Lena." She bolted out of bed, fumbling for her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly that it took several tries to unlock it. The screen illuminated the room in harsh blue light. The hallway was empty. The bedroom closet door was still closed. Nothing, just the sound of the wind and the distant, hollow ticking of her old wall clock. Determined not to lose her mind, Lena convinced herself it was sleep paralysis, the after effects of long hours and fatigue. She sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping herself in the blanket, trying to steady her breathing. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the room with her, watching, waiting. The next morning, she called in sick. She spent the day in bed, lights drawn, trying to ignore the lingering sense of unease. Her neighbors, a retired couple downstairs, seemed kind enough when she bumped into them in the lobby. Mrs. Hargrove mentioned casually, "This building, some strange things happen here. You'll hear stories if you stay long enough." Lena smiled politely, but didn't ask for specifics. She didn't want to know. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. Lena's nerves frayed as she traced the sound to the window, but there was nothing outside except the swaying branches. Then came the creaking, slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway. Lena's breath caught in her throat. This time, she wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was walking in her apartment. The lights flickered and the temperature dropped sharply. Lena grabbed a kitchen knife, her pulse hammering. She crept toward the bedroom, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. The creaking stopped again and silence fell, suffocating in its intensity. Then she heard it, the soft, deliberate click of footsteps behind her, echoing her movements. She spun around. Nothing. Her bedroom door was ajar, though she was sure she had closed it. She pushed it open fully, flashlight slicing through the darkness. The closet door swung slightly, though no breeze could reach it. The closet had nothing in it but clothes. She exhaled shakily, telling herself she was overworked, stressed, imagining things again. She climbed into bed, leaving the knife on the nightstand, and pulled the covers over her head. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the wind and the occasional, unmistakable sound of creaking floorboards. 2 nights later, Lena was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, when she noticed a faint mark on the window. It was small, like a handprint, smeared into the condensation from the cold outside. She wiped it away, convinced it was dirt or condensation, but her heart didn't calm. That night, the whispers returned, insistent, persistent, circling her as she lay in bed. This time, she could make out more words, fragmented and horrifying. "You can't leave. Don't look. They're here." Lena's phone was dead when she tried to call 911, even though it had been fully charged minutes before. The lights flickered violently. The shadows in the corners of her room seemed to move independently, slithering across the walls. She wrapped herself in blankets, curling into a ball, praying the night would end. By dawn, she was a trembling mess. The sunlight did little to alleviate the terror. She called work, citing illness, and spent the day pacing her apartment. Her neighbors were out. The building was silent, except for the wind and the occasional groan of its old frame. The following evening, Lena decided she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. She packed a bag, intending to stay with a friend until she could figure out what was happening. As she moved to leave, she noticed the front door had been unlocked despite her locking it multiple times. A chill ran down her spine. She locked it again, grabbed her bag, and hurried out. She didn't get far. Halfway down the block, a shadow detached itself from the alley beside the building. It was humanoid but grotesquely elongated, its movements jerky and unnatural. Lena froze, frozen in place by the horror of recognition. The figure's face was her own, distorted, pale, eyes hollow. She ran, screaming, past the street lamps that flickered overhead, but when she looked back, it was gone. She didn't stop running until she reached the diner at the edge of town, where the warm lights and chatter of patrons finally grounded her in reality. Over the next few days, Lena stayed with her friend, trying to rationalize what had happened. But the nightmares persisted, always the same. Creaking floorboards, whispers, shadows that moved on their own. She tried to call Mr. Whitaker, but the building's number was disconnected. The landlord, it seemed, had vanished. Driven by desperation, Lena researched the building's history. She found accounts in old newspaper archives. Suicides, mysterious disappearances, deaths by unknown causes. One article caught her eye. A tenant had vanished in 1974, and her body was never found. Witnesses claimed that neighbors heard footsteps and whispers in the night, leading up to the disappearance. Panic gripped Lena. She realized she hadn't just been experiencing random hauntings. She had been living in the building where the missing, the lost, and the dead lingered, trapped between the walls, waiting. One night, she returned briefly to her apartment, needing to retrieve some belongings. The wind was howling, stronger than ever, rattling the windows. Lena's flashlight flickered across the hallway, and for a split second, she saw them. Figures pressed against the walls, pale and featureless, mouths opening in silent screams. She stumbled back, nearly dropping her bag. The shadows moved with her, stretching, elongating, and whispering her name. Lena didn't stay. She left, and she never went back. But even months later, she could feel them, trailing her in the periphery of vision, whispering in the quiet moments. The nightmares never ceased. She moved across states, changed jobs, changed her number, but the shadows followed. Always a step behind, always whispering, always waiting. Her friends, colleagues, and therapists all suggested stress, trauma, or unresolved grief. Lena wanted to believe them. She clung to normalcy, to logic, to the mundane patterns of everyday life. Yet, on cold November nights, when the wind howls and the world seems empty and waiting, Lena feels it. The cold weight pressing on her chest, the faint creaking of floorboards in the dark, and the whisper of her name echoing from some unseen corner. No matter how far she runs, no matter how many locks she uses, no matter how many new towns she burrows herself into, the shadows of Millersville follow her, and she knows deep down that the night never truly ends. Story the end. Cold wind rattled the loose pane in the kitchen window as Mark Halpern stood barefoot on the linoleum, staring out into the darkness behind his rural Ohio home. November had a way of stripping everything bare, trees, fields, nerves. And tonight, the night felt heavier than usual. The clock above the stove read 11:47 p.m. He should have been asleep hours ago, but sleep hadn't come easily since the incident on Route 29 earlier that week. He rubbed his face and tried to push away the thought. He wasn't going to think about it again. He wasn't going to picture the twisted metal, the flash of something pale in the headlight beam before the car hit the guardrail, or the way the airbag burned across his arms. The sheriff had found no one else on the road. No body, no animal, no explanation. Just Mark's story. Something ran out in front of him, and a totaled front end. Everyone in town had chalked it up to a deer. That's what deer did, they said, ran straight into cars. It happened all the time. But deer didn't look like that thing. He took a slow breath and turned away from the window. The house, an old farmhouse he'd bought cheap when he moved back after his divorce, creaked as the cold settled deeper into the beams. The furnace clicked on in the basement, a comforting thrum. He poured the last splash of cold coffee into the sink, shivering as the copper pipes gave off a faint metallic echo. He needed sleep, and maybe, just maybe, tonight it would come. He turned off the kitchen light, walked down the hall, and was reaching for his bedroom door when something scraped across the back porch. He froze. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so faint he might have dismissed it as a branch shifting in the wind, if not for the way it dragged, slow, steady, intentional. He held his breath. The sound stopped. He waited. Nothing. It's just the cold, he whispered to himself. Wood shifts. He didn't believe it, but he said it anyway. He pushed into the bedroom, closed the door, and clicked on the small lamp beside his bed. It cast a weak amber glow over the unmade blankets. He sat down and reached to untie his boots. He still hadn't taken them off. That's when the scraping started again, but this time it was directly beneath his bedroom window. Mark sat perfectly still, he bade, one hand gripping the edge of the mattress. The scraping lasted 3 slow seconds, 4, 5, then silence again. He forced air into his lungs. He wasn't going to panic. He wasn't going to call the sheriff again, like he had 2 nights ago when he thought he saw someone outside near the tool shed. The deputy's polite but unconvinced face had been embarrassing enough. He stood, crossed the room, and lifted the edge of the curtain with 2 fingers. Darkness stared back. The yard was a black void, broken only by the distant outline of his barn against the cloudy sky. No snow yet, but it felt like the kind of night that promised some by morning. The porch light flickered weakly, as though something had brushed past it. He scanned the yard again. Nothing. He dropped the curtain and stepped back. Maybe it had been an animal. Raccoons were always around, or stray dogs, or... His phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling him so violently he knocked the lamp with his elbow. It wobbled but didn't fall. He grabbed the phone, unknown number, at nearly midnight. He hesitated only a second before answering. Hello? Static answered first, then a whisper, so soft he could barely make it out. You saw me. Mark's skin crawled. Who is this? He said sharply. You saw me. The voice was breathy, distant. On the road. Mark's throat tightened. This isn't funny. Whoever you are. You shouldn't have looked. The call ended. He stared at the screen. His hand was shaking. The call time, 08. 8 seconds. His mind raced. Scam? Prank? One of his coworkers? But the voice had not sounded like any man he knew. It had been thin, rasping, unnatural. And the words, you saw me. On the road. No one knew about what he'd seen except the sheriff, and the sheriff didn't know the details. He swallowed hard and set the phone down. He needed to calm himself. He needed to breathe. This was probably a coincidence, a wrong number with someone messing around. He made himself lie down and pulled the blanket over him, boots and all. The house ticked and settled in the cold, each sound exaggerated by the silence. He stared at the ceiling. At some point, exhaustion took over. He slipped into a shallow, uneasy sleep. A pounding at the door startled him awake, adrenaline flooding his chest so fast he gasped. He sat up. Pale light seeped through the curtains, morning. He looked at the clock. 6:12 a.m. The pounding came again, harder this time, rattling the hinges. Mark? You up? Open the damn door. It was his neighbor, an older farmer named Ray. Reliable, quiet, early to bed, early to rise, and not someone who pounded on doors at dawn. Mark stumbled out of the bedroom, legs stiff from sleeping in boots. He unlocked the front door and pulled it open. Ray stood on the porch, breath clouding in the cold air, his face pale beneath his cap. You all right? He demanded without preamble. Mark blinked. Yeah, why? You didn't hear it? Hear what? Ray stared at him, mouth tightening. Your damn barn door. It was slamming open and shut all night, loud enough to wake the dead. Mark frowned. The barn door's latched. I locked it yesterday morning. Well, it ain't locked now. It was wide open when I drove by on my way to feed the cattle. A chill spread through Mark's chest. Open? Wide open. Ray pointed with one gloved hand. I closed it for you, but you'll want to check. Storm's coming. Wind'll tear it right off if it swings like that again. Thanks, Mark murmured. I'll go look. Ray hesitated, then lowered his voice. You sure you're doing okay, son? Folks said you had a scare this week. Mark forced a reassuring smile. I'm fine. Ray didn't look convinced, but he nodded once and walked back toward his truck. Gravel crunched as he pulled away, leaving Mark alone in the morning stillness. He turned toward the barn. The grass was frost-crusted, crunching under his steps. He scanned the yard automatically. Nothing seemed out of place. But as he approached the barn, something in his stomach tightened. The latch on the barn door was indeed unhooked, not broken, not torn loose, just unhooked, like someone had carefully lifted it. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of old hay and cold dust. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the slats, laying thin stripes across the dirt floor. Everything seemed normal. But then he noticed the footprints. They started near the door, the outline faint but unmistakable in the dirt. Not a boot print, not a shoe, a bare foot. Small, thin. The toes splayed oddly as if the foot was malformed, and the prints led deeper into the barn. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears. He followed the prints with hesitant steps. They wound between old wooden stalls, past his dusty tool bench, stopping at the far wall, where there was nothing but a stack of rotting boards and old feed sacks. The prints ended abruptly at the wall. No sign of anyone. No sign of where they had gone. Mark backed toward the barn door, breathing hard. He stepped outside, gulping cold air as if he'd been drowning. This wasn't possible. Someone had been in his barn last night. Someone barefoot. He looked toward his house, toward the windows he had assumed were staring out into emptiness. A sickening thought twisted in his stomach. What if it had been watching him? What if it had been closer than he realized? He hurried back into the house and locked the door. Then locked the back door. Then checked the windows. All locked. He was pacing the kitchen when the phone rang again. He flinched. He let it ring twice, staring at it. Unknown number. He answered. He didn't speak. Neither did the caller, but he heard breathing, slow, wet, wrong. Then, "You left the barn too soon." Mark slammed the phone down so hard it nearly cracked. He backed away from the counter, chest heaving. He needed help. He needed the sheriff. He grabbed his keys and coat and headed for the front door. But when he yanked it open, he froze. Sitting on his front step, perfectly centered on the welcome mat, was something pale and thin and round. A deer skull, cleaned of flesh, the eye sockets staring straight up at him. Mark stumbled backward and hit the wall. His hands shook violently. He hadn't seen any scavengers around, and skulls didn't just appear on doorsteps. Someone put this here. Something put this here. He forced himself forward and nudged the skull with his boot. It rocked slightly and revealed something underneath. Paper, folded, damp around the edges. He crouched, lifted the skull with the edge of his boot, and picked up the paper. It was a torn sheet from some book. Cheap pulp, yellowed. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. There were only 3 words written on it. "You saw again." His vision swam. He dropped the paper and stumbled to his truck, unlocked it, and climbed inside. His breath fogged the windshield as he jammed the keys in the ignition. The engine turned once, twice, then died. No. He tried again. Click, click. Nothing. He hit the steering wheel, a sound escaping him somewhere between fear and frustration. He looked back toward the house. There, on the roof, near the chimney, something pale moved. Something small. A shape hunched low, watching him. His blood iced over. He couldn't make out details through the glare on the windshield, but he saw the outline. Thin limbs, 2 long fingers pressed to the shingles, head cocked unnaturally to one side. Watching. Waiting. He ducked down in the seat, heart pounding so hard he felt sick. He grabbed his phone, hands fumbling, and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, calm and steady. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone on my roof, Mark whispered. Someone's been stalking my property, breaking into my barn, leaving things, calling me. Is the intruder armed? I don't know what it is. Sir, stay inside your vehicle with the doors locked. A deputy is on their way. Mark peeked over the edge of the dashboard. The roof was empty. The thing was gone. He stayed locked in the truck until he saw the sheriff's SUV pull into the driveway. Sheriff Coltman stepped out, adjusting his belt and squinting toward the house. Mark nearly ran to him. They searched the roof, the yard, the barn. Nothing. No footprints except his own. No sign of forced entry. No sign that anyone had been there. Coltman listened, but looked unconvinced, though not unkind. Stress can do strange things, the sheriff said, especially after an accident. People see shapes and shadows, hear animals, and think it's something else. You should talk to someone." "It wasn't in my head," Mark snapped. "There were footprints in the barn." The sheriff sighed. "Dirt shifts. Raccoons dig. You'd be surprised how human prints look in the right light. And the skull on my porch? Kids messing around? Teenagers love that kind of crap. They called me." "Scammers spoof numbers all the time." Mark stared at him, disbelief cracking through his voice. "I know what I saw." "Do you?" Coltman asked quietly. "Or do you know what you think you saw?" The sheriff left a half hour later, promising to increase patrols. Night returned faster than Mark expected, and with it came the dread. He kept every light in the house on. He didn't want darkness anywhere. He triple-checked the locks, shut every curtain, and sat at the kitchen table, gripping a mug of coffee he never drank. Every sound made him flinch. At 10:34 p.m., his phone buzzed again. He stared at it. Unknown number. His breath trembled in his chest. He let it buzz. It stopped. Then buzzed again immediately. He answered. Silence. Then, "Come outside." He hung up instantly. 2 seconds later, the porch light flickered, then went out. The kitchen lights flickered next. Mark stood slowly, backing away from the table. The whole house went dark, black, cold, silent. Then came the scraping, along the siding, from the back of the house, moving toward the front, slow, deliberate. Mark reached for the drawer beside the fridge, fumbling until he found the flashlight. He clicked it on. It gave a weak beam, barely illuminating the floor. The scraping stopped. He heard breathing, just outside the kitchen window. He pointed the flashlight at the window, hand shaking violently. At first, he saw only the reflection of the beam on the glass. Then something moved. A face slid into view, pale, hairless, eyes too large, too dark, sunken deep into the skull. Its mouth hung open, thin and wide, the shape wrong, so wrong. It stared at him and smiled. Mark screamed and stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The face vanished instantly, like it had dropped straight down. He ran to the living room, grabbed his coat, and reached the front door. His hands shook as he fumbled with the lock. He threw open the door and froze. The thing was standing at the bottom of his porch steps, not crawling, not crouching, standing. Its limbs were long, impossibly long, arms nearly reaching its knees. Its skin looked stretched too tight over bones that jutted at odd angles. Its head tilted, studying him with those huge black eyes. Mark couldn't move. The thing took one step forward, slow, silent. His instincts finally kicked in. He slammed the door so hard the frame rattled and locked both bolts. The thing's weight hit the door an instant later with a dull, sickening thud. Mark backed away, then ran for his bedroom. He slammed the door, shoved a dresser against it, and grabbed his phone. He dialed 911 again. The dispatcher answered. "There's something trying to get into my house," Mark gasped. "Send someone, please. Send someone." "What is trying to get in?" "I don't know. Something not human." A pause. Then softly, "You shouldn't have looked," the same voice. Mark dropped the phone like it had burned him. Something scratched at his bedroom window. He turned slowly, dread crushing every breath. The thing was pressed against the glass, its face flattened, mouth gaping wider than any human mouth could. Its fingers tapped the window rhythmically, each tap a message. Tap, tap, tap. Then, impossibly, the lock on the window turned. Mark lunged forward and slammed his weight against the frame, forcing it down just as the thing pushed upward from the outside. He grabbed the latch and locked it again, then stepped back, tears burning in his eyes. The thing tilted its head, studying him. Then it whispered through the glass. "You saw me. Now I see you." The window panes spiderwebbed, cracks shot across the glass. Mark stumbled backward, searching for something, anything he could use as a weapon. He grabbed the lamp and yanked the cord from the wall. The window burst inward. Cold air and shards of glass exploded into the room. The thing slithered through the opening with sickening ease, folding its limbs in ways that made Mark's stomach lurch. He backed into the corner. The thing crawled toward him. Slow, methodical, inevitable. Its face hovered inches from his. He felt its breath, cold, damp, rotten. Its voice rasped, "You shouldn't have looked." 3 days later, Ray Simpson noticed Mark's truck still parked in the driveway, unmoved. The house was dark, too dark. He knocked on the door, no answer. He called the sheriff. The deputies forced entry. They found broken glass in the bedroom, blood on the floor, dragged footprints. One set marks, one set small, barefoot, imprinted faintly in the wood, leading to the broken window, leading out into the cold November night. They never found Mark. But sometimes late at night, drivers on Route 29 report something pale flashing across their headlights, something small, something watching from the tree line. And every once in a while, someone swears they hear a voice whisper through static on their radio, "You saw me." Story the end.